The fifth thing, sex, the spiritual covenant, the covenant of marriage. Sex is one of the most powerful gifts God has given humanity. Its design united a husband and wife in a bond of love, intimacy, and spiritual oneness. Yet, in today's culture, sex has been distorted into something casual, something to enjoy without consequence or commitment, self-serving, and detached from its original purpose. The world tells us that sex is purely physical, but the Bible reveals a much deeper truth. Sex is a spiritual covenant. It's a spiritual covenant meant to deepen intimacy within marriage. From the very beginning, God designed sex as part of the covenant of marriage, an act that unites a husband and wife in a profound spiritual way. A covenant is more than a contract. It's a sacred agreement sealed by blood and meant to last a lifetime. In Genesis 2:24, we see the foundation of this covenant. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they become one flesh. This isn't just a poetic description. It's a spiritual reality. God created sex to unify a husband and wife in a way that reflects his covenant with us. It's meant to be exclusive, sacred, and life-giving. In the Old Testament, covenants were severe. Blood was often shed in a covenant to symbolize the life-changing bond being created. Similarly, in marriage, the act of sex seals the covenant. For virgins, the breaking of the hymen and the shedding of blood symbolize this sacred bond. When we enter a sexual relationship without marriage, we're creating a bond that lacks the foundation God intended, leaving us vulnerable to brokenness and confusion. What is a covenant? A covenant is a sacred, unbreakable bond between two parties, often sealed with blood. Unlike a contract, which can be terminated if one party fails to meet its terms, a covenant is a lifelong commitment. Marriage is one such covenant, with sex as its physical and spiritual seal. Through sex, two people become one flesh, not only in body, but also in spirit and purpose. This bond is so profound that it mirrors the relationship between Christ and the church. Ephesians 5:31-32 says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. Just as Christ gave himself completely for his bride, the church, sex within marriage, symbolizes complete giving, trust, and unity. Sex is spiritual, not just physical. Often sex is seen as a personal choice, but it has powerful spiritual consequences. It creates an inseparable bond between two people forming one flesh, as described in Genesis 2:24. This isn't just a physical joining, but a spiritual one, intertwining lives and souls. When sex occurs outside of marriage, it disrupts the purpose God intended for it. And this can lead to soul ties that become spiritually damaging. Each time we engage in sex without the covenant of marriage, we're essentially creating a new bond that can bring lasting complications, impacting our future relationships, our spiritual growth, and our sense of self. The dangers of misusing sex. The cost of breaking the covenant. When we step outside of God's design and engage in sex without the commitment of marriage, we create spiritual, emotional, psychological burdens, and sometimes physical consequences, even if we don't see them immediately. For instance, many people carry feelings of regret, guilt, or resentment toward past partners, which can interfere with future relationships. Casual sex in relationships create soul ties, as we discussed in the previous chapter. These ties can bring confusion and emotional pain and distance us from God's plan for our lives. When used outside of God's design through pornography, casual relationships, or infidelity, it loses its sacredness and creates spiritual, emotional, and physical consequences. The Bible warns us of this in 1 Corinthians 6:18. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. This isn't a message of condemnation, but of protection. God desires to protect us from the damage that misused intimacy can cause, help us live in purity and freedom, and show the value God places on keeping the marriage covenant pure and strong. Here are some of the dangers of misusing sex. Emotional damage. Casual sex often leads to feelings of emptiness, guilt, and shame. It creates connections that were never to exist outside of commitment, leaving emotional scars. Soul ties. As discussed in the previous chapter, sexual intimacy forms a bond that goes beyond the physical. When these ties form outside of marriage, they can lead to confusion, spiritual entanglement, and difficulty moving on. Distorted identity. Misusing sex can cause you to view yourself or others as objects rather than individuals made in God's image. It undermines the dignity and value God has placed in you. Separation from God. Sexual sin creates a barrier between you and God, not because he stops loving you, but because sin distances us from his presence. The story of a broken covenant. There's a story of an up-and-coming pastor who, despite his best intentions, ended up having sex with his fiancée before marriage. Though they married soon after, his wife later revealed she held resentment because they hadn't waited, feeling as though they hadn't honored God fully. Even though they were committed to each other, that one decision affected their marriage for years. Want to hear the rest of this chapter? Don't stop here. Take the next step in your transformation. Get the full audiobook, eBook, and interactive workbook today. Click the link below to unlock the complete experience.